Vir Sanghvi is one of India's most high profile journalists, columnists, editors, writers, and television hosts, known for his equal opportunity reverence for the political class. He is also one of the sharpest chroniclers and raconteurs of his time, having had a perch on major news stories over the last 4.5 decades. The 65-year-old Veer has now turned his eye on his own life in a memoir that he has characteristically titled A Rude Life, published by Penguin Viking. In a sense, his career runs parallel to the India through the decades, from the 1970s until today. Using the memoir as his reference point, Vir Sanghvi spoke to Mayank Chhaya reports on a variety of subjects, from politics to showbiz, and from pop culture to hard news. As someone who has written about, interviewed, and interacted behind the scenes with India's movers and shakers over the decades, Veer Sanghvi brings to bear both deeply informed and entertaining takes on various subjects. Veer Sanghvi. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to address you by your first name. I hope you don't mind.
No, I mean, for the purposes of every conversation, please address me by my first name.
All right. No, હું કહેવાનો હતો કે આપણે લગભગ એક જ ઉંમરના છીએ. You are 65, I'm 60, so not much.
તમે ગુજરાતી છો?
રાજકોટના.
અરે મારે જો. Okay, my father also. I didn't know that. Somehow I always assumed you'd be a North Indian or some description.
No, born in Ahmedabad, very much a good part Kathiawadi.
Kathiawadi? Okay, so I'm half Kathiawadi too.
No, pleasure to meet. Let me not waste your time. I know you're on a break in the Maldives.
No.
Which island are you on?
I am on, the Maldives is very funny because there are thousands of islands.
Right.
So each island is actually a hotel. So I am in the Ba Atoll, which is one of their most famous atolls, UNESCO protected, and I am in a hotel called Soneva Fushi.
Oh, I went in 85 with VP Singh of all people.
That's right. That's one of the oldest of the luxury properties in the Maldives. So, and they're much fancier and more expensive properties. But this is, I think, one of the nicest.
Yeah, it is. It is. No, I'm glad you're having fun. Explain the title of your memoir, A Rude Life. Why rude?
Well, I do a column called Rude Food, and I am frequently asked to explain the title of Rude Food. And again, there is no explanation. The column was done in a hurry. They had to think of a name in a hurry. So Rude Food seemed clever and witty in a sort of moronic newspaperish sort of. And the title caught on. So the word rude, I think the marketing department of Penguin felt was associated with me. And my publisher felt that the book had a very irreverent tone because I wasn't overly respectful of people. So she thought rude would go with that. And given that her first suggestion had been hard to read on the grounds that I, as a person, am hard to read, but which every reader would have thought referred to the book, and so don't buy it, it's hard to read. I was very grateful when she suggested A Rude Life, and I said, yeah, we'll call it that.
Actually, it's a terrific title. I think
I'll tell her that. I'm sure she'll be preening when she watches this.
Was it difficult for you to write about the early parts of your life without coming across as a name dropper? And the reason I'm asking this is because your father had a remarkable range of people that he knew and interacted with, from the Shah of Iran to the crusty and curmudgeonly Morarji Desai to the controversial V.K. Krishna Menon, who was the defense minister under Nehru, and the great Dilip Kumar. How did you manage not to come across as someone who's dropping names?
Well, I tried very hard not to do that because my father was a remarkable man. He was brought up in Rajkot in a lower middle class family, one of 14 children. He had none of the advantages that I was born with. And whatever he was completely self-made. And that was despite having, in my view, wasted years of his life by not starting a career of any description, becoming a worker in the Communist Party till they fell out. Despite that, despite starting late, despite a disastrous first marriage, despite marrying my mother, only doing the bar when he was in his 30s, he managed, I thought, incredibly well. So I was quite happy to name drop on his behalf because he had a truly remarkable life. He had a short life because he married my mother and started his career in the 30s, when he was in his 30s, and he died when he was 50. So it was pretty much the star that burns twice as brightly, burns half as long. So I was quite happy to do any name dropping on his behalf. On my, as far as I was concerned, the fact that Krishnaman came to my house or Dilip Kumar came to my house had was no reflection on any ability of mine. I just happened to be the son of my father.
Uh, I want to introduce a measure of levity before we get into the more serious aspects of this conversation. Is it a hair dye or you've had a facelift? And I ask because
Oh,
you
this
write,
is a hair dye. This is a hair dye. Every time you see it, you'll see a little bit of
yeah,
white over there. This comes from a bottle, and I have to do it every 10 days or so. This I don't bother about. When I was doing TV, they used to make me do it once a couple of months or so. But I mean, all that slitty gray is here. The rest of it seems all right. So I think God said to me, I'll make you bald at an early age, but I'll let you keep the rest of it black for a while. So that's what's happening.
no,
Bald over okay, but okay over here.
the reason I'm asking is because in your book you write that as a 19-year-old you taught a term at Mayo College.
Yes.
And there are times when you end up coming across much older people who thank you for teaching them English, and people wonder that you look so young. How could you have taught a term at Mayo? And you say that is it a facelift or a hair dye? That's why I'm asking you this
It's
question.
actually even worse because I see sort of people who look middle aged coming up to me in
Yeah.
front of other people who don't know me that well and saying, You're Vir Sanghvi. And I say, Yes, sir, you taught my father when he was at school. And this guy looks like he's already well into middle age. So people look at me very strangely. But
Right.
what to say? How can you explain it?
You began working as a journalist sometime in 1976 when you were
Yeah,
just about 20. The
I,
emergency was
I
on.
turned 20. Yeah.
Right. The emergency was on, and India was going through a harrowing, rather weird time. What are your memories of that time as a journalist?
Well, I have memories of that time as an Indian because it was an extraordinary situation. Because in 73, I went to school in England, and then I took a year off between school and university, and I went up to university in October of 76. Now, I don't know if this is true any longer, but at least in that era, every time you went abroad, and particularly if you were my father's son and had these progressive views, you believed that Western media was out to attack India, that they were jealous and resentful of the fact that we had made something of ourselves. So when Western media criticized India, you became a super patriot and you were defensive about your country. So my first reaction, even when the emergency started and I was at school in England when I read about it, was to say, no, no, they're just being unfair. It can't be so bad. Fortunately, it coincided with my year off. So I was in India and I actually said to myself, it's not so bad, it's worse than I ever imagined it could be. And that's when I became very, very critical of Mrs. Gandhi. But the horrifying thing about the emergency, which nobody talks about now, is the extent to which people hailed it as an era of discipline. The number of middle class Indians who bought the trains run on time kind of nonsense.
Right.
The number of people who said, yeah, so she's censored the press and locked up the opposition. So what, yeah? At least this country is running well. So it made me wonder, the middle class, who was the educated middle class, and it had many of the advantages that were denied to other Indians, chiefly the poor, had this low end opinion of democracy. Where were we headed? Where were we going? Then, of course, Mr. Gandhi lost the election. The same people who said, this was not a bad thing, it was necessary, changed their minds and said, well, it was a good thing to begin with, but then it became bad later. So I have always questioned how skin deep the commitment of the Indian middle class is to liberal democracy.
It is indeed skin deep, and you can see it manifesting in various ways now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm not surprised by many of the responses I see now. I've always thought that Mr. Modi has less in common with Mr. Vajpayee, Mr. Advani, any of his sort of ideological forebears, more in common in his style, in the way he imposed himself on situations with Indira Gandhi, and
Right.
more common with the way in which he approaches dissent with Sanjay Gandhi.
Right.
In a sense, he's very much a creature of the Congress, despite being a BJP leader.
That's ironic. You,
Yeah.
you mentioned how magazine journalism was not a thing in those days, and it was Khushwant Singh alone who had a rather remarkable style of writing, which some journalists tried to emulate to a disastrous effect. Uh, how were you fashioning your style as you were beginning to write for a lark, as it were, early on in that nascent world of magazine journalism?
Well, I think because I was writing for India Today, and India Today set out to be, though it didn't necessarily say so officially, but this was clear in the office, we set out to be India's Time magazine.
Right.
So our approach very much was the sort of Time magazine approach that if you mentioned somebody, you were obliged then to say what his age was. So it would be Vir Sanghvi, 65 said. If you said that it was a tall building, then the copy was sent back to you and people would say how many feet tall it was. So there was this obsession with facts, figures, details, and there was always this desire to write in this typical Time magazine style, which I think was memorably described once as backward ran sentences until reeled the mind. And yes, I did start out writing in that way, which in a way was good because the Khushwant Singh approach to journalism was where you saw everything through the eyes of the journalist. I arrived in Moscow. I went and saw the ambassador. I said to him, I can't get scotch in this godforsaken country. Send me scotch. So, which may have been interesting if you were fascinated by Khushwant Singh, which fortunately for him, many people were in those days. But if the rest of us did it, who would give a damn? So, the India Today style, which is sort of impersonal, came as an interesting counterpoint to that Khushwant Singh style. And it was very good training in a way, though I was really irritated that I had to put figures into everything, that every adjective had to be qualified. It was actually quite good training. I think now, in retrospect, that I learned to write in that style with India Today. It imposed enormous rigor in the way in which I wrote. But basically, to the extent that I have a recognizable style, and that comes through probably in my opinion pieces
Right.
and in this that I do that's about ideas, that came from university because I was at a university where their idea of studying was that every week you had to write an essay on a subject. They gave you a reading list. And then you went in and read out your essay, and your tutor, who was this incredibly brilliant man, would rip your essay to shreds. And you had to then defend it and say why you believed what you did believe. And the importance that gave to the level of thinking, I think, is what has influenced my writing more than anything else. It's not what you write, it's how you think that makes the difference.
This was during the interregnum before you went to Oxford. You said you already had some 25 bylines by that time.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Yeah,
Did
I mean,
that-
not necessarily wonderful articles, also small, silly articles, but I had the bylines all right. Yeah,
Right, right. India Today had those people little pieces, right?
yeah. I
Paragraph to
used to
paragraph.
lots of little snippets. Yeah,
Right.
Parveen Babi is back from Hollywood. She didn't get a role.
Right.
She was excited about being on the cover of Time magazine. So in my career with India Today, I did everything. I wrote about the formation of the BJP and what it meant, and I wrote about Parveen Babi coming back from Hollywood. So there was no class system, there was no structure, there was no snobbery. Whatever the job was, you just got on with it and wrote about it.
Absolutely. I find reading some excerpts online that serendipity appears to have marked your early life at Oxford. For instance, you talk about how you got a grant from Senville Council
Yeah,
paying for your tuition fees.
yeah.
Tell me a bit about it. Not only was your education free, as you write, but you were paid to study there as well.
Yeah, I mean, long live the welfare state. Sadly, as you might not be surprised to know, it didn't last that long. But the story is as follows. I was born in London. I've explained in the book why I was born in London, because my mother went there for a very difficult pregnancy, which entitled me to various things that entitled me till recently. Now I think it's too late. I could have taken a British passport if I had wanted to. And my father was very clear, and I think I inherited all his prejudices that you'd rather die than give up being an Indian passport holder if you were going to live in India and to write about things in India. If you want to go and live in England, take a British passport by all means. But if you're going to sit in India, you're going to want to edit things, then I think you should have an Indian passport, which I had no problem with. So when I applied for university, when they asked you to write whether you were British or not, I wrote that I wasn't. I was foreign. And in those days, probably even now, the British, no, actually it's changed now. In those days, British students studied free. The
Right.
rest of us paid an overseas fee, which was very large. The colleges, the Oxford colleges, all bitterly opposed the overseas fee because they said it's a great export education as far as we're concerned. If the world's elite is educated in England, it will benefit England much more than your nuclear warheads and all of that will. So every time you went to a tutor and you had to fill up the form and you wrote overseas student, they would find a way of arguing that you weren't an overseas student. So in my case, when they discovered I was born in London, they said British. I said, hang on, I have a Indian passport. How am I British? So I said, no. They said, no, that's British. So they said, are you eligible for a grant? So I said, no, grants are given to people who live in England by their local councils. And they said, don't you have a relative who lives here? So I said, I have many relatives who live here. So he said, give me an example. So I gave the example of my aunt Sharda Ben, who lived in Birmingham in the area under Sandwell Council. And I said, well, she lives here. So they said, how long has she lived here? I said, for many years. So they said, has she paid lots of taxes? I said, I'm sure she has. Time for her to get something back. So even though I was already in Oxford, I had joined, I wrote off and I phoned Sandwell Council. And to my horror, they said, we'll pay your fees, no problem at all, and we will give you a maintenance grant. So I then discovered that at the beginning of every term in my pigeonhole, there would be an envelope from Sandwell Council with this check, which took care of everything, and I had no fees to pay. So you can understand why I'm grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. This is amazing. I'm glad you told that story. Your father was sort of in and out of journalism. He had
Yeah.
one foot there. Was that one of the reasons why you chose to be one yourself, or you already had decided on your own?
No, I didn't actually set out wanting to be a journalist. My father was a journalist in the sense that he wrote columns. He
Right.
was not a reporter in the sense he did go abroad to cover, say, conferences, but that was international affairs. And he didn't go to the newspaper office every day. His columns were written from home. Occasionally, he would drop into the Blitz office and meet the editor. He certainly didn't make his living out of journalism. So I was familiar with the world of journalism, but just as it had been a sideline for my father, I thought it might become a sideline for me. I never intended it to become a principal career. And then by just stroke of luck, as you say, serendipity, I
Right.
knew some people who worked for some people. They'd started India Today. Nobody was willing to write for India Today because of a small unknown publication. The people in Bombay who could have contributed thought it was beneath them to write for India Today. In any case, when they were persuaded to write, India Today thought their articles were rubbish. So I was hanging around. This was my year off, and I was inexpensive. I was cheap. I was paid
Right.
between 25 to 50 rupees for a small item, and I think between 150 to 250 rupees for a large story, which was more money in those days than it
It
sounds
is.
like today, but still wasn't a lot of money. So I was really cheap and I wasn't dependent on that to make my living. So I was pushed into it. I enjoyed it. I found an aptitude for it. They said to me, when you come back from Oxford, why don't you edit this new magazine we're starting? And most people struggle to find something. And I said to myself, if God has got something waiting for me, I should take it. So I sort of stumbled into it by good luck, I think.
Slight digression. Your father was an ideological curiosity, a Gujarati communist. I know of
Yeah.
only one more whose name was Batuk Vora, who was in
Uh,
fact an MLA on behalf of the Communist Party. He was a journalist too. How did he uh, find himself in the communist realm in Gujarat, and that too in Rajkot?
it's very odd because he was brought up in Rajkot, which wonderful city that it is. There was no evidence that Karl Marx made a lot of difference or anybody read it. But he, on his own, discovered Marx. He discovered Marxism. He read as much as he could about it and was converted at a fairly early age. And with the confidence and the passion of the newly converted, he first converted all his friends in Rajkot and then he converted all his friends in Ahmedabad, many of whom were my mother's family, who were rich mill owners. And which is why my mother's father and people were appalled that here was this lower middle class communist who was converting their family and wanted to take all their money away. But he was really sold on the cause. You don't give up everything, join the Communist Party, live underground, go to jail. So he was a true believer. Sorry.
The emergency had just ended in 1977.
Yeah,
and I mean, political writing for magazine had not yet fully developed.
right.
And I read in your excerpts that among the first stories that you were asked to do, or you suggested, was about Satyam Shivam Sundaram and
Yep.
Raj Kapoor. But so I find it rather juicy. Tell us about Raj Kapoor, Satyam Shivam Sundaram, Zeenat Aman's ample bosom, and the way you eventually ended up featuring both of them on the cover.
Yeah, it's a story that sounds actually less and less politically correct these days. So I try and shroud it in layers of political correctness. But what happened was this: I was working for India Today in Bombay during my vacations, because in Oxford I was at university for 6 months, and I was back in Bombay for the other 6. And there weren't that many stories you could do. I did a very boring cover story in the
Yeah.
textile industry. Then they asked me to do something on the garment export business. I was getting really fed up of doing this nonsense. So it occurred to me then that there was this big film being made called Satyam Shivam Sundaram. And it
Right.
had become a big scandal because photographs from the set had been leaked. And those photographs showed Zeenat Aman and Shelby say somewhat revealing poses. And Raj Kapoor had then shut down all access to the press. He banned everybody and become a huge scandal. So I thought if we could do a story on that and do it properly without being sort of prurient or anything, we would have a proper story on our hands. So I persuaded my boss, Arun Puri, to do it. And I persuaded him because Time magazine was our Bible then, by showing him a story Time had done on Stanley Kubrick when he
Right.
made Barry Lyndon, called Stanley Kubrick's Greatest Gamble. So I said, with a staggering lack of imagination, we'll call this Raj Kapoor's Grandest Gamble. And he went for it. The problem is getting Raj Kapoor. So we were then convinced, because he wouldn't return our calls, he banned the press, etc., that we would end up doing something else. So I had a backup idea. Zeenat Aman, I think, was a phenomenon when she became a star because she was
Right.
Western, she was different. So she was shooting for what is probably the worst film made in India, a film called Shalimar in Bangalore, made by a man called Krishna Shah. I'm sure very
Krishna
nice,
Shah, yes.
yes, fellow Gujarati, but I don't think he made a very good movie. Anyhow, so I went to Bangalore and Zenith was there. And I spent a couple of days and I did an interview with Zenith. And I came back confident that we could do a cover story with Zenith. At which stage Raj Kapoor finally called back and we had this interview and we went to see him to talk about the film. And he was not the kind of man who gave very many interviews. And it was clear why he didn't give very many interviews, because he had no filter. He just said whatever was in his mind. He sat in this little garage, it looked like, in RK Studios,
Right.
which was referred to as his cottage, which sounded very grandiose. And there were these Gandhis over there. He would sit on them. He would drink endless cups of tea. He would never once get up to go to the loo. So obviously there was some plumbing there that I hadn't worked out. He would take calls. He would entertain visitors. He would do everything. So we went, and I went at least, and I sat in front of him. And I said, will you tell me about Satyam Shivam Sundaram? And he talked and he talked and he talked. And the idea was, he said, that there's a beautiful woman with an ugly voice, which itself is not such a bad idea, that there is a contrast between the two. Unfortunately, he then drew the example of a existing top playback singer who was not pleased and who I've tried not to mention. But then, having said beautiful voice, he went a little bit further into the level of ugliness of his heroine. And it was clear his definition of ugly was the scar over here. The rest of her body was perfect. The rest of her face was also perfect. And so I asked as timidly as I could about the controversy, about the pictures that had been released. And he
Right.
said, okay. And he showed more pictures, which were even more revealing. And I was a little surprised. And I said, aren't you worried that the film will become only about this? And he said, let them come to see Zenith's. And here I am editing the exact word. Let them come to see Zenith's body. They will go away remembering my film, which I may or may not have happened. It's never clear to me. But he was like quite a compulsive in the subject, and he went on and on. And for me, I was at university. Here I was talking to this great movie mogul who's giving the only interview he'd ever given on this subject. And it was just spilling it all out. It was a fairly heady experience.
Right, right. From Immanuel Kant and Karl Marx at Oxford
That's right.
To Raj Kapoor and Zenith Aman was
But
quite
it
a
was,
transition.
because I would finish doing this and the story would take a while. So it would appear while I was at Oxford. by which
I
stage
see.
I was in a philosophy tutorial discussing, as you say, Kant and Hegel and stuff like that.
That's I found it rather hilarious.
Mhm.
How did you begin to break away from the inevitable draw of Hindi cinema in Bombay and start what turned out to be your career's calling, serious, insightful writing about various subjects?
Well, it was easy enough to do within India Today because I was covering
Right,
HN Gunas convention, the founding of the BJP, and then when I became editor of Bombay magazine, we did a certain amount of Bombay politics, Bal Thackeray,
right,
Sharad Pawar, etc. So I didn't do that much film writing for Bombay. I did do film writing for India Today because I thought, perhaps arrogantly, that I had invented that kind of genre, the news magazine film cover story, which focused on stars and yet was not gossipy and yet seemed like serious journalism. So I read many such stories after Zinat Aman and Raj Kapoor. I read one on Sham Benegal and then most famously one on Amitabh Bachchan, also for India Today. But I mean, I didn't write about the films. I didn't write an essay on why Diwar was so wonderful. I wrote about the people and what made them special.
right. You witnessed Indira Gandhi for about 6 years after having become a journalist. What
Yeah.
was your broad strokes impression of her, both as a human being and as a leader?
I didn't know Mrs. Gandhi as a person, so I can't comment very much on what she was like as a human being. I think she was a remarkable leader. She was incredibly charismatic. She was very strong. She took a lot of abuse and bounced back.
Right,
But she also believed, like many leaders after her, that she was indispensable. She believed her own publicity. She believed that anything that was done to protect her position was justified because it helped her continue to run India, which I think happens to, you can be unkind and call it megalomania, where it happens to many strong leaders at a situation. They begin to confuse the country with themselves. They
right,
think that whatever is done in their own interest is therefore done in the country's interest. And if you oppose that leader, which surely in a democracy you should do, you are opposing the country. Therefore, you are anti national.
right.
So much of what we see today, Mrs. Gandhi was the trailer. We're seeing the movie now, but she sowed the seeds of what we're seeing.
Devkan Barua's notorious construct, India is Indira, right? You,
But if you go on to Twitter and you are to see the BJP trolls, they say much worse things about Mr. Modi and India, about
that is
how
true.
he India and how to attack him is a anti-national, a traitor, etc. So there's always been that strand in Indian politics. I don't think it's BJP specific or Congress specific. I think it's leader specific.
At what point did you see Mrs. Gandhi from the prism of the emergency, which was, of course, a brazen assault on civil liberties and the media?
But I never forgave Mrs. Gandhi for the emergency. I don't think many people forgave her, at least not intellectuals or thoughtful people. But what did it for me wasn't the emergency, it was Sanjay.
Right,
She promoted this guy who was a thug like character who'd been thrown out of school, out of university, whose sole skill appeared to be being a motor mechanic, who gathered hoodlums and gundas around them. And not only did she promote him, she allowed him to humiliate her advisors. Huxer, PN Huxer,
right,
would help create the legend of Indira Gandhi, was humiliated, his family were persecuted. Inder Gujral had an argument, was information broadcasting minister, had an argument with Sanjay Gandhi when Sanjay Gandhi called him and said, "Why isn't television only about my mother?" And he
right,
said, "I'm sorry, it has to be something more than that." And Sanjay said, "Ye sab nahi chalega." And Nandar Gujral was very angry and seen this boy grow up, said, "Ye
right,
zarur chalega." And the next thing you know, Indra Gujral was sacked.
right,
So
absolutely.
Mrs. Gandhi just promoted him to this absurd extent. And it struck me as odd that if this woman is so committed to India, and in some ways 100% she was, then she would not impose this guy on India. But of course she did.
But what a remarkable flaw that was, because people forget that it was someone who had, in 1971, essentially helped birth a new country, unlike perhaps
Yeah,
any modern leader in the
yeah,
world. Bangladesh, we are talking about.
yeah.
How did these two extremes rather reside in one person?
I don't know. I think the only sort of explanation I can think of is that when there are great leaders, and there's no doubt that Mrs. Gandhi was a great leader, they often rise to the occasion. And not only do they rise to the occasion, they do things that were considered impossible. I don't think anybody in Pakistan thought at that stage that they would be stopped from getting away with the genocide in East Pakistan, as it then was, or that India would create a new country out of East Pakistan. Because the Pakistanis, don't forget, had the Chinese on their side. They had Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger on their side.
Right.
And Mrs. Gandhi stood up to all of them and did it entirely on her own. But often experiences like that make you do such amazing things, make you believe you're an amazing person. And I think the trick to being a successful leader at the very top is recognizing that whatever you do, the country is more important, and that long after you go, there will be a country. I don't think Mrs. Gandhi thought that. Mrs. Gandhi thought without her, India would collapse or it would become a complete rubble. And therefore, she thought she could do whatever she wanted because her interests were India's interests.
Absolutely. You had a perch on her action in the storming of the Golden Temple in killing of Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale.
Yeah.
What were your immediate impressions of that action?
Well, first of all, I think there's no doubt that something had to be done. The way in which Bhindranwale had fortified the Golden Temple, the way in which people from inside the Golden Temple, the Akal Takht where Bhindranwale was hiding out, were going out and spreading terror was terrible. There were many, many opportunities when the government could have intervened. There was a time when a DIG of the Punjab police called Atwal went into the Golden Temple to pray, and
Right.
Bhindranwale's men killed him. And his body lay there for, I think, 2 days because nobody had the guts to go near there and to claim him. If during that period you would send the army in or you'd send commandos in, you would have had huge, huge public support. During all of these opportunities, Mrs. Gandhi sat tight. Then, when it looked like it was almost too late, when people said Bhindranwale would declare a republic of Khalistan and they would raise the Khalistani flag, I don't know if that was true, but that was certainly the intelligence she got, she decided to act. There
Right.
was no thought given to what they would do. They called General Sundarji, who was in charge of the operation, who was a bluff, old-style army chap, most at home in the mess, who said, no problem, we'll have these jokers out by 11 o'clock and we go to the mess and have a beer. No, it was never, ever going to be that simple. And when it went wrong, when they couldn't do this, when they couldn't clear the Golden Temple, they brought in tanks, they brought in armored personnel carriers, they destroyed the Akal Takht. The Harmandir Sahib was riddled with bullets. In the process, you took many moderate Sikhs, and by desecrating their holiest shrine, you made them somehow sympathetic to Bhindranwale. So I think the way in which Blue Star was executed, they chose a day which was a martyrdom of a Sikh guru, of a Sikh saint. So there were people, pilgrims, who were trapped in the Harmandir, many of whom were killed in the crossfire. No thought was given to how they would do it. And then afterwards, to sort of justify the mess that the army made of the operation, they exaggerated what had happened. Every day there'd be a program on Doordarshan, and a general or a soldier would come and talk about the brave victory of our boys. And we're talking about what? We're talking about the whole Indian army fighting 500 Sardarjis, largely with handheld weapons.
Right.
So there was certainly a question of proportion. So yeah, I oppose Blue Star bitterly for those reasons.
Right. I've been long fascinated by the period between June and December 1984. I think a lot of people don't even connect the points here. Think about it. In June, you had the Golden Temple action. It was
Right.
immediately followed by Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. Then in
Yeah.
October, you had the Sikh massacre, etc. That was followed by
The assassination is October 31st. The massacres are the first week of November. You're right. Yes.
and then you had the Bhopal gas tragedy. Now,
Yeah.
for a country of like India to have such staggeringly diverse tragedies in a span of 6 months, and yet somehow negotiate through it was I thought it was quite remarkable. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought it was a very remarkable period. And in a way, it seemed at that stage that Mrs. Gandhi's prophecy was self fulfilling. I remember I wrote an article then,
Right.
quoting Gordon, saying, can the center hold? Because there were moments when you felt as though the whole dream of India was collapsing. There was violence on the streets, mobs were looking for Sikhs, were killing them, murdering them. The violence against Sikhs was horrible. And it was often done by neighbors. You'd lived with your neighbors for like
Right.
many years. Suddenly they came one day, they caught your grandfather, they put three tires around his body and they set fire to them and they laughed while he burned to death. I mean, what kind of person does that? The level that of violence and hatred that was unleashed, I think really frightened me. And I wondered how India would survive. And
Right.
one of the reasons I think Rajiv Gandhi got that huge mandate was that people just wanted to be reassured. They just wanted to feel that things are okay. Tell us that things are going to be okay. Because, as you say, Blue Star was an enormous event. The
Right.
assassination of Prime Minister by her own guards was an enormous event. The riots unleashed all over India was a huge, huge event. And the Bhopal gas tragedy was an event without any parallel. So it was not actually unreasonable to wonder what the future held for India.
Right. Right. Uh, I mean, I'm going to rush a bit because we have constraints on your time. How
Okay.
do you view the rise of Rajiv Gandhi? I was still in Bombay as a journalist working for the Associated Press, and I
Mhm.
remember a great deal that there was so much anticipation about him, especially the fact that he was so young and so modern in his outlook. What were your early impressions of him?
Well, my first impression, I have to say, was not favorable.
I
And
see.
that had nothing to do with Rajiv Gandhi. I didn't know Rajiv Gandhi. I was just, I mean, after Sanjay, it seemed to me that another dynastic succession done without any kind of proper endorsement. I mean, he was sworn in, he was in Calcutta when his mother died. He came back and he was immediately sworn in. It was a little like Papa Dog giving way to Baby Dog. And I really thought that the whole thing was slightly Duvalier-esque and
Right.
un-Indian. So I began, I think, as being very, very hostile to Rajiv Gandhi. I believed at that stage that Chandrasekhar, who was leader, effectively the leading figure in the opposition, would have made a much better prime minister after Indira Gandhi. But the more one saw of Rajiv Gandhi as prime minister in the early years, the more you were struck by his sincerity. He was an odd person because he came from political family. He owed his job, let's be honest, to his birth. But you couldn't deny he'd still won the biggest majority anybody had been ever given by the Indian electorate. You couldn't deny that there was some element of sincerity. Mrs. Gandhi, in the last years, ultimately dealt in hatred. Rajiv Gandhi dealt in reconciliation. The Sikh Accord, the Naga and Mizo Accords, the bringing of peace to Assam. Almost everywhere he went, the early meetings with Benazir for Pakistan, almost everywhere he went, he tried to quell hatred. He tried to find some way of bringing people together. And because this was such a terrible time for India, you had to admire somebody who brought compassion and peace at a time of hatred and a time of chaos. I didn't actually meet him till 87, and the book,
I
I
see.
think, has that meeting. So, but even from afar, I admired what he was doing, though he was not the kind of person I would have voted for.
But he started on a rather macabre note. I'm sure you remember his construct again at a rally saying, "जब
The
बड़ा
big tree.
पैर गिरता है तो धरती तो हिलती है."
Yeah, but do you know what he said? Because it's an interesting and controversial speech, because it's normally taken to mean
Yeah,
asked to, asked to comment on the massacres of the Sikhs. He said when a big tree falls, the earth is bound to shake, and people make parallels with Mr. Modi's response when he was asked about the riots or massacres in Gujarat. He said, "For every action," referring, I
right,
imagine, to the Godhra thing, there is a reaction. So, what do you expect? In both cases, the individuals concerned have explanations. If you now, Rajiv's speech was made extempore. There are some recordings of it, and I haven't actually seen the recording, but the Congress's version was he talked about how people thought India would break up, how India would not survive after Indira Gandhi's assassination. And yes, we went through tough times. When a big tree falls, meaning Mrs. Gandhi, the earth is bound to shake, but we are together now and nobody will break us. Now, if you take it in that context, it isn't quite a comment on the massacre.
no, you're right.
In that context, it is. So it depends on how you look at it.
In fact, not that I want to inject myself here, but he did tell me personally exactly what you're describing. But
Yeah.
then he didn't bother to counter at that point.
But not only did Rajiv not bother to counter it later when
Right.
the speech was dug up, when people had forgotten and the BJP said this is what he did. Nobody in the Congress bothered to say this is what he meant or this is what we think he meant. They were just happy to let this go on the record unchallenged, which is what has happened.
Absolutely. Once again, two major features defined his political life. One was, of course, apart from being a modernizer in many ways, he brought the ICT revolution to India, which is undeniable through the agency of Sam Pitroda. Uh, but Bofors gun scandal and the debacle in Sri Lanka defined Rajiv Gandhi in many ways. In fact, the latter took his life through Vellupillai Prabhakaran of the LTT, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Nadu. What do you think? Where do you think he went wrong with Sri Lanka and Bofors?
Well, both are quite different. In the case of Sri Lanka, he, I think, overestimated India's influence. He genuinely believed that because, I mean, let's not kid ourselves, the LTT was trained and created by India. He
Right.
believed that because we had trained the LTT, because we were financing the LTT, that if we told the LTT, now we have agreed to a peace deal, give up your arms, stand for election, and everything will be all right. He believed the LTT would agree. And he was very relieved when the LTT said they would agree and that they would surrender their weapons. When he discovered that they hadn't actually surrendered their weapons, there'd been token surrenders, that the military operations continued, when the Sri Lankans said to him, the Singh Sri Lankans, that the deal you brokered has been based on dishonesty. He
Right.
was decent enough to say, no, we will have some peacekeepers and we will impose peace. We will make sure that the Sri Lankan army doesn't have to do anything. Our army will make sure that the Tamils give up their arms. And I think he just, because he was trusting of Prabhakaran and he was over optimistic about the willingness of everyone to expect a decent political settlement rather than a military problem. I think he completely screwed it up on those grounds. And once it was in quicksand, they just kept sinking and sinking. It's
Right.
ironic. Prabhakaran, who was essentially his mother's creation, was the man who killed Rajiv.
Absolutely. Correct.
Indirectly, but yeah.
Yeah. That brings me to the weird and rather extraordinary rise of Vishwanath Pratap Singh. I
Yeah.
was in Delhi in 1989 and had a fairly strong ringside view on things. What was your impression of VP Singh?
Well, I knew VP Singh before I knew Rajiv Gandhi, and you met him in those days. When you met him, and he was at the finance ministry,
Right.
and until then, there'd been a fair number of sleazeballs in the finance ministry who'd done deals with lots of local industrialists, etc. They had favorite industrialists, and VP Singh, though people haven't realized this enough, was a Raja. All his office and everybody in his office called him Raja Sahab. I mean, there's all Raja and he Fakir hair stuff was only for public consumption. He had the Raja's contempt for the Banya. He really didn't like business people. He thought that, he said at one stage, pick up any stone and you will find a businessman crawling under it. And this was reported, but I think people didn't realize how much it reflected his mindset. He really, really hated business people. But having said all of that, he was still, when you met him, at least when I met him, and I was fairly young at that time, plausible, soft spoken, was not motivated by money, seemed at that stage completely committed to the Congress culture. And you thought that he's fine now. And I had a slightly contrary view because during that period I was a friend of Amitabh Bachchan's, and
Right.
Amitabh was telling me what VP Singh was doing to him in Allahabad and how sly VP Singh was and how he'd sabotaged his career.
Right.
So I had a slightly contrary view of VP Singh. And ultimately, as I've said, I think in the book, VP Singh was a little bit like Arvind Kejriwal today. He was a bright man, well educated, hardworking, committed to some version of helping the poor, not at all interested in money for his own sake. But at the end of the day, a man who believed in nothing except for his own advancement. He would throw everybody else under the bus if it helped advance his own prospects, which frankly is what Kejriwal has also done when you look at all the people from the Anna movement and see them under the various buses that Kejriwal has driven. I think VP Singh was a little bit like that. Though I have to say, this is a view that comes after many years of reflection. To begin with, I was a cheerleader. I was very enthusiastic about it.
Right. You mentioned Mr. Bachchan. I had a couple of points to make to you and see how you react. What do you
All right.
think of his rather excruciatingly calibrated modesty?
It's not so much modesty, I think, as much as it is shyness.
I
He
see.
is an incredibly shy person. He finds it very difficult to engage with people. He is also, I think, he's a very private person. He's quite paranoid about losing his sense of self. And it's very difficult to have a sense of self if everywhere you go, people are throwing themselves before you and touching your feet or mobbing you and all of that. So I think, and we've seen it from various stars at various times, but for Amitabh, this has been true since what, 75,
Right.
76, like 50, 60 years. And he used to, I did the story in India Today, he used to talk a lot about it and about how being a star had taken away a lot of his normal human emotions. For instance, he said, the last 7 films I've shot, my mother has died.
Right.
In every film, I have had to react differently because you don't react the same way to my mother's death. I sometimes ask myself when my mother dies, at that stage, Teji Bachchan was alive, God bless her soul, how will I know how to react? Do
Absolutely.
I really have any genuine reactions within me?
Right.
So I think he fought very hard to try and keep that sense of self. He
Right.
was also, I think, determined not to become a filmy. It's a strange thing to say, but Dr. Bachchan, his father, who's of course a noted poet, ran a very sort of cultured household where they were very keen on culture. I'll give you one example that Dr. Bachchan told me when I interviewed him for the Amitabh Bachchan cover story. Mrs. Bachchan, Teji Bachchan,
Right.
is a Sarvani. So
Yeah.
Amitabh Bachchan is basically half Sikh. Yet, though he's taught himself Punjabi and speaks Punjabi and all of that, the image that you have Amitabh Bachchan is this guy from Allahabad who's UP like. And I said this to Dr. Bachchan, and he said, yes. He said, do you know that in my house I told Teji and everybody, no Punjabi is to be ever spoken. And I said, why? And he said, because it spoils your Hindi pronunciation. So
Really.
he was, yeah, really, it was that strong. So Amitabh was brought up in that kind of household. So one never really escapes what one's parents are. No?
Absolutely. Interesting you should mention Dr. Bachchan. After the Coolie accident in 1982,
Yeah,
I happened to be at Pratiksha. I was a young reporter for the Free Press Journal, and I was the only journalist with my dear photographer friend Gopal Shetty. We were
right.
waiting for a young man who had run back literally backwards from
I
Baroda to
remember. Yeah.
Bombay.
Gone to Siddhivinayak, that guy.
Yeah.
Yes, I
First,
remember
we
that guy.
went to Mr. Bachchan's house in the morning.
Yes. Yeah.
And while we were waiting, I ended up having a great conversation with Dr. Bachchan, during which he practically wept, saying that, look at the devotion my son has. This man has done backwards from Baroda all the way for his recovery. Now, with that kind of insane fame, I see what you're saying when you talk about some of his attributes. I just wanted to put it out there. I'll just have 2 or 3 questions. I hope you don't mind.
No, please go ahead.
We are in the midst of the 30th anniversary of the Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh economic reform. In fact, it was just 3 days ago, precisely. How has that transformed India electorally in such a manner? I think you have talked about it, that every 10 years there is a new generation,
Yes.
which in the last 30 years, you're essentially looking at 3 generations which have impacted the way country has behaved electorally. What's your overall sense of the economic reform and what followed electorally?
I think that if there hadn't been Dr. Manmohan Singh's electoral reform, not electoral reform, sorry, economic reform, there wouldn't have been electoral victory for Mr. Modi. I
That's
think
a
in many
remarkable
ways,
statement.
yeah, when you think about it,
Yeah,
because if you look at the most vocal Modi supporters on social media, many of them, if not most of them, are first generation middle class people. They're people who grew up in homes where
right.
English was not spoken, newspapers were not regularly read, nobody had a telephone, nobody had a car. These were sort of attributes you dreamt about. Now in India, a panwala has 3 telephones, everybody takes this granted. This wouldn't have happened without Manmohan Singh's reforms. And while India had grown at what we call the Hindu rate of growth, there'd been a slow, steady rate of growth, which had allowed people as they entered the middle class to accept what were considered then middle class values or secular values. But when there was this rush to affluence, which was triggered by the Manmohan Singh reforms, I don't think people necessarily came along with those old middle class values. Instead, because they suddenly had money and they suddenly had power, they began to resent the old middle class. They
Right.
began to hold them responsible for whatever sins, real or imagined, there were in India. If you look at this abuse that Mr. Modi's people have encouraged, which is to refer to somebody as Lachans or
Yeah.
as they say, Lutians, to
Yeah.
refer to them that way, the idea is what? I mean, what is Lachans? Lachans was an architect who designed central Delhi. Who lives in central Delhi? Who lives in those bungalows? Mr. Modi, Mr. Amit Shah, their guys.
Absolutely.
So when they talk about Lachans, it's actually meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. But we know what they're talking about. What they're talking about is the old English speaking middle class.
Right.
The people who they felt inferior to, the people who they felt treated them with scorn or with disdain. I mean, whether this is real grievance or an imagined grievance is a matter of opinion. But these are Mr. Modi's people. These are people who've now got money, who've now got affluence, who now have power. They see one of their own at Racecourse Road or whatever he wants to call the new house. And they therefore want to overthrow or rail against at least the old middle class. And Mr. Modi, because he uses these terms himself and his people use those terms,
Right.
encourages that sentiment. I mean, if you attack Mr. Modi, you are always described as a member of some Lachans mafia, which had it very easy because you listen to these guys during the time when India had English speaking prime ministers. Everybody else who was English speaking went on foreign holidays, ate beefsteaks for dinner, drank champagne, and we were all in it together. But now that is over. Now we all eat vegetarian food. We all eat dal bhat, rotli, shak. All these ugly buildings that were designed by Lachans will go, and some Gujarati architect will come along and build a new India. So what they're doing on the basis of prosperity they got because of Manmohan Singh is trying to create a new India in their image.
Right. That brings me to the last two figures. One is, of course, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, whom you knew very well, and Narendra Modi. What's your assessment of Vajpayee as a historical figure?
I think he'll be remembered as an important historical figure, but with each passing year, he becomes less important. He was important, I think, because until he came along and until he and Advani came along, to be fair to poor old Advani, the opposition to the Congress came from ex-congressmen, whether it was VP Singh, whether it was Morarji Desai, etc. The battle was really a battle between different versions of the Congress, whether they called themselves Janata Party or whatever. Even Charan Singh was a congressman. People forget that. Mr. Vajpayee showed that a completely different ideological strand that was historically always opposed to the Congress could come to power.
Right.
But he also showed when he came to office that this strand all been told by the Congress consisted of evil people with horns on their heads, etc., was not like that. That they may have had a different worldview, but they were perfectly capable of holding India together, of not making minorities feel insecure, and creating a new India. So I think at that stage, all of us thought Mr. Vajpayee was very important. Unfortunately or fortunately, Mr. Vajpayee made Mr. Modi possible. And Mr. Modi is not a Vajpayee-like BJP leader. He's a completely different leader. And whether he is in direct descent from Vajpayee or Sanjay Gandhi, I think remains to be seen.
Right. How have you viewed the spectacular rise of Mr. Modi from a generally affable, behind the scenes functionary of the RSS to now searingly divisive and derided, even on the other hand, deferred to Prime Minister?
I think Mr. Modi would argue that he was all of those nice things we said about him, affable RSS backroom boy, until the Gujarat riots, when he would argue that he was unnecessarily vilified by the media. I mean, to some extent, there is some truth in that. There is no doubt that he changed as a person after he was continually attacked over Gujarat.
Right.
But such a utter and complete transformation from being the old Mr. Modi to being the new Mr. Modi, I mean, I don't think that can be explained by a few articles for a few months about the Gujarat riots. I think Mr. Modi struck a chord. I remember after the Gujarat riots and that election campaign that he fought, when people thought he would be apologetic and inclusive and try and make up for the riots, he was even more divisive. He actually fought that election on the basis of the riots.
Right.
He made references to Mia, Musharraf, etc. There were all kinds of dog whistles and coded references to minorities. I think he struck gold there. And he suddenly realized that if you went outside the political consensus, you said the unthinkable, then there were Hindus there who were looking for leadership and they would make you their leader. And ever since he's found that tune, he's played it nonstop.
How do you see the Pegasus spyware story? In fact, today I was watching a sort of a joint event by Rahul Gandhi and a bunch of other opposition leaders. They seem to have tasted blood in the water. Do you think it has any teeth to it for the Prime Minister politically?
Okay, there are different views on this. Am I appalled by Pegasus? Do I think it's a shocking indictment of the kind of surveillance state that we've become, that the government can buy spyware, presumably for national security purposes, and use it not just to target political opponents, but even people like the girl who says she was harassed by the Chief Justice? I think tells us very sad things about India. And we have no manner of doubt that has to be the government, because Pegasus has told us, the company that owns Pegasus, that it only sells to governments. Now, I'm willing to believe that the Pakistan government bought it and tried to hack the phones of a few influential Indians. But if you look at the level of the hacking and the kinds of people, it's unlikely that any foreign government would be interested in them.
Right.
So it's not unreasonable to believe that we did it ourselves. So yes, I'm completely shocked by it. Is it, however, the knockout blow that the opposition thinks it is? I don't think it is. I don't think it's had that much impact on ordinary people. I don't think the scandal has legs. Unless they can come up with something in the next few days, I think the scandal is now receding.
And finally, it's a subject I would have liked to talk to you more about, but I think I can't let you go without it. You've been a rather remarkable chronicler of India's cultural rise in the last maybe 2-3 decades. It pretty much tracks with the economic reform. What do you think are the most striking features of India's cultural life as having changed by the economic reform?
I think the broad basing of entertainment in India, until now, there was just cinema. Cinema in India meant one thing. Everybody saw the same film, whether it was you or your neighbor or a guy in a village, etc. That's not true any longer. You now have so many different aspects. At one stage, there was just Hindi cinema and Hindi film songs. It was Lata Mangeshkar or Kishore Kumar. Now there's so many different genres of Indian pop, some of which, or most of which actually, have nothing to do with Hindi cinema. If you look at the OTT streaming services, they've changed the nature of entertainment. I don't know if you watched any of these shows. Some of them are quite good, but every second sentence is a Mahabain ki gali. I mean, it was sort of unthinkable at one stage. So that's changed. We've also come to terms with the fact that, when the Chinese say that Crouching Tiger, Sleeping Dragon was a big hit, or Bruce Lee was a big hit, they mean that they've crossed over to a non-Chinese audience globally. Right. India, we haven't done that, but because the diaspora is so huge, we don't even need to do that. Indian designers, Indian movie stars, people who make it really big abroad, when you do these shows which these stars go into and make millions doing, it's just the Indian diaspora. So we've globalized ourselves, we've reached the diaspora, and we're doing well. But that single breakout hit, that single craze that affects the whole world, our own Gangnam Style or whatever, hasn't happened yet.
Hasn't happened. Sure. No, this has been, for me, very stimulating. I hope you liked it. I'll, of course,
I really enjoyed it. Thank you. You really got me thinking. Thank you so much.
No, it was wonderful talking to you, and enjoy the Maldives.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thanks so much.